morning, everyone. Whoa, should I say that again? Good morning, everyone. All right, very good. That's more like it. Thank you for joining us. My name is Brahima S Coulibaly. I'm the Vice President of our Global Economy and Development Program here at Brookings. It's really my pleasure to welcome you both here and also those online for this conversation on India's path to prosperity with Professor Raghuram Rajan. To sort of set the stage, I think India has been, as you may know, a bright spot in the global economy that is otherwise sluggish overall. And it has the fastest growing major economy. And on its present trajectory, it will become the third largest economy in the world by the end of this decade. So India's economic prosperity begs several questions, among which, what accounts for this success? What will it take to keep the economy on the path to prosperity? And importantly, will India escape the middle income trap that has held back other emerging market countries in the past and reach upper middle income status? As the world's largest democracy, India is currently holding national elections, and there are concerns that the country's institutional framework is fraying even amidst its economic success. Will this affect India's growth prospect? And if so, what needs to be done to bolster democratic and civic institutions? The challenge for India is to accelerate economic development by investing in education and training, expanding opportunities in high-skilled services and manufacturing centered around innovative products, and making India, as Professor Rajan puts it, a ferment of ideas and creativity. India's democratic traditions can support this path, helped by governance reform that strengthen its democratic institutions and enable a greater decentralization. As India goes to elections, the choices it makes matter to the world. Today, we are really delighted to host Professor Raghuram Rajan, whose new book, Breaking the Mold, India's Untraveled Path to Prosperity, that he co-authored with Rohit Lamba, addresses these and other important questions on the Indian economy. By way of introduction, Professor Rajan is a Catherine Miller Distinguished Service Professor of Finance at the Chicago Booth Business School. He previously served as the 23rd Governor of the Reserve Bank of India and also as Chief Economist and Director of Research at the International Monetary Fund. So we look forward to hearing his views on the economic and broader challenges that India faces at a critical juncture in its post-independence journey toward becoming a major world economic power. So today's conversation will be moderated by our very own Eswar Prasad, who is a senior fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program and also professor of trade policy and economics at Cornell University. So with that, please join me to welcome them both. Eswar Rajan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kool. It's very nice to see all of you. And Raghu, it's wonderful to host you here at Brookings. You've written an excellent book on India, and it's very well timed given how important the economy is, as Kool said, to the world economy at large. And also, India is at a very important moment in its economic and political journey to perhaps becoming a great power. So Raghu, there is a lot in this very fine book that you've written, but let's start by talking about your motivations for writing the book. You know, Salman Rushdie tells us that you write a book only when you cannot avoid writing the book. What led you at this moment in particular to writing this book?
Well, we a bunch of us spent the pandemic discussing what was happening in India and what our hopes for the future were, as well as some of the structures and challenges in India that we had inherited from independence and required changing. This is not just economists. There were political scientists and a small group. But at the end of it, we said, well, this discussion can't remain within the group. We need to start talking about it more widely. And, you know, we obviously procrastinated. And then sometime early, towards March, April last year, I said, look, elections coming. If you want to influence anything in the course of ideas, you better write a book before the elections. And so then we went into a mad hurry. Fortunately, the publishers cooperated with us, and we managed to write the book fast enough to get it out before the elections. And it's hopefully having some impact on the sort of upper end of the debate in India. Of course, elections are about much more than sort of economic vision and so on, and we can talk about some of that. But that was the motivation, that you can't stay on the side and just be armchair intellectuals. You need to enter the debate, and you need to put your ideas out there, and we've tried to do that this time around.
Having written with Raghu, I can tell you he's a very fast writer with no loss of clarity. The sharpness that you bring to your arguments is something that I have seen firsthand, of course. You have this very interesting narrative approach in your book. At some parts of the book, you tell stories about specific companies, specific individuals, and then at one part of the book where you enter some broader territory, you have this interesting narrative device where you and your co-author refer to yourself as the editor, and there is somebody who asks you questions. What led you to that narrative device?
So, we like the best of authors, we plagiarize. And what really motivated, so we wanted to have a book which was accessible to the lay reader. And that meant even as you talk higher theory, you need to make it more concrete through examples. And so the book is full of examples, both of what has gone right in India and what has not worked. And so that was part of what we were trying to do, make it accessible. But also, at some point we sort of were really fascinated by a book that Mahatma Gandhi wrote called Hind Swaraj. And in Hind Swaraj, Gandhi talks to the other side by having somebody bring up all the arguments that the other side talks about, and Gandhi sort of tries to explain his side. And this is an old tradition in India of basically confronting the arguments of the opposition. And what we wanted to do is engage the opposition, by which we mean the illiberal forces in India, but we didn't want to do it in your face up front right in the beginning of the book. We want to admit there is a lot going on that is good, that is working, and we need to build on that, and the liberal approach is probably the best way to do that in India. But even while we were doing that, we also wanted to confront the direct arguments of somebody who was steeped in mainstream administration logic. That is the current administration. And so we wanted them to give us their arguments, and we respond. And so that was chapter 13, which a lot of people come to, as they read the book and then say, hey, this was interesting, but we didn't want to make that the centerpiece of the book. So there we have somebody who's very convinced that the majoritarian nationalist approach is the right one, and then makes arguments in that regard to us, and we sort of try and confront it. But that's one part of the book. The rest of the book is really about the way forward for India.
Yeah, I noticed that you take the approach of having the narrator ask the questions and you're addressing them, rather than the Socrative method of sort of turning the questions around, although implicitly in some of the writings you can see that element entering.
Well, it was actually an attempt to confront some of these points with data, and to say, look, these arguments don't make a lot of sense once you look at the data. Just as a one of the questions is, why are we pampering minorities in India? And actually, you look at the data, certainly the biggest minority, the Muslims, haven't been pampered socioeconomically. They've done much worse than the majority community. And so, those are the kinds of arguments we confront there, and hopefully offer a convincing rebuttal.
Okay, so there is a long journey in the book to chapter 13 where you talk about these much broader issues. So let's talk a little bit about the substance of the book. But in terms of the overarching theme, what would you like the audience to take away from, maybe just in a minute or two? What are the biggest picture elements of the book?
This is always the hardest thing to do, right? What's the one-liner about the book? One-liner is really the China way of manufacturing exports-led growth is no longer open or feasible for India. The world is not ready for another China doing exactly what China did. Instead, there is a path for India which is untried. That is why it's a path we haven't really achieved yet. But we've gone some way along it, which is allows services to be the leading export sector of the economy. This is not about saying India will do only services, no. But services can be the leading export sector of the economy and not emphasize as much the low-skilled manufacturing path to growth. And we're saying India could actually do this. It accounts now for 5% of global services trade. Less than 2% of manufacturing. So it's much more, not just in software, but in consulting, in legal services. JP Morgan has 3,000 lawyers in India providing services for its operations across the world. We think this could be the way for India to grow, but it means an entirely different allocation of resources from the one the government is on. And so what we're saying is this election matters. Forget all the issues about democracy and so on, we can come to that. But this election matters just from the vision for where India goes. And we think the vision could well be a different path. India is not China, India is India. And let's talk about the Indian way to growth, which can be much more environmentally friendly and which has much greater chances of succeeding than trying to go head to head with China today.
So when you think about that proposition, you seem to be running against what we've learned from history. Practically every country has gone through this traditional transformation from a primary goods-led economy to then being a manufacturing one, and then the economy matures and becomes a services-led economy. And I suppose one important element of that narrative is that the manufacturing sector is very important in terms of generating high-paying jobs so that you can develop a middle class and organically increase the size of your market, and then you start specializing in services. So you're suggesting that India, which has been taking a different path, can actually stay on that path. First of all, is that because India is weak in some respects in terms of promoting the manufacturing sector? Is it a function of what is happening in the rest of the world? Or does it really play to India's intrinsic strengths in some way?
I think a bit of all these, a bit of each one of these. First, I think the manufacturing exports-led path made a lot of sense when countries were poor, didn't have much domestic demand, needed scale. You get a lot of benefits from scale. And they were going head-to-head with an industrial world which had highly paid employees in manufacturing. So the cheap Chinese worker was competing with a well-paid American worker. And we know that there were a lot of job losses in the US because, even though the cheap Chinese worker in the beginning didn't have great infrastructure, didn't have great rule of law, didn't have all the other trappings that would increase productivity, they had cheap labor. Now, to some extent, that has been competed down to the point today when you're entering that business, you're still competing with China because China hasn't left low-skilled manufacturing. It still is employing people from the Western provinces in some of that, basic assembly. But you're also competing with Vietnam, with Bangladesh. You're not competing very much anymore with the American worker or the European worker. They've left those areas and they've moved much more into automated, higher-skilled manufacturing, right? So what is that? Recognize the fact rents have disappeared. And one easy way to see this is to ask about two companies. Apple does all the stuff that Apple does, but hasn't manufactured a thing since 2004. Who manufactures for Apple? It's Foxconn, right? And Foxconn does all the assembly and stuff that happens in Taiwan, happens in China. Now they're coming to India. What's Foxconn's market value? 50 billion on a good day. What's Apple's market value? 3 trillion on a good day. Apple is worth 60 times Foxconn. Why? Because it captures the high end of the manufacturing supply chain. The ideas, the innovation, the creativity up front that resulted in the iPhone, and the iTunes, the content, all that, which is on the other side, the finance, the marketing. Those are all services. Of course, innovative, skilled services. But that's the high end. That's where the rents are. And what we're arguing in this book is to start at the low end and try and climb your way up. Is much harder today, but may not even be necessary. Now, services weren't a means of big trade earlier, because very hard to transmit services at a distance. But if you can provide consulting services from Denver to Chicago during the pandemic, you can do it from Bangalore to Chicago or from Hyderabad to Chicago. And companies are recognizing this. They are increasingly moving to employ people elsewhere. Consultants are now part of a global team of consultants, one in many parts of the world coming together. Only problem is ours, but Indians are willing to work at night, as we can see from our airports. So what that means is there's a whole new set of opportunities because of changes in communications technology. Moreover, if you look at manufacturing, as I gave the Apple example now, a lot of products are really a huge amount of services embedded in the final manufactured product. So take, for example, Tesla. The car is 40 million lines of code plus. I mean, especially as they go towards smart cars. And so to that extent, I think increasingly there's a bigger role for services. Last point, services don't necessarily require the scale that manufacturing does. So you can provide a lot of services even domestically. And what we have in the book is many examples of Indian services starting up to provide for the Indian market. So importantly, even as the world is turning more protectionist, I think this offers a pathway for India which can sort of sidestep some of the protectionism, goods protectionism that is taking place. And of course, there's a big question: why would service workers in the developed world see their lunch eaten? And it need not be that way. The whole point about trade is win-win. If India starts buying more consulting, legal, financial services from the rest of the world, even while growing richer by selling its services, the point is developed countries are 70 to 80% services. And so they too, the biggest service exporter in the world is the United States. It has a strong incentive to keep the world open to services, to expand its services. Why can't US medical services of a specialized nature be delivered to India? Vice versa. We can have trade. I mean, it takes me 3 months to get an appointment to see a doctor here. Why can't that be made easier? But similarly, why can't doctors in India benefit from the knowledge of some of the medicine at the frontier here? So it seems to me there's a whole unexploited sort of set of activities that can actually take place if India chooses a different path for growth. It requires a lot of work, and that's what a lot of the book is about. What work do we have to do?
So we'll get there to what India needs to do, but let's stay a little more on services and manufacturing. So when you think about services, you're right that the US exports a lot. Tourism services, education services, our universities get a lot of foreign students, which are education exports, medical services and so on. If you think about what we associate with India, it's back office processing. I call my credit card company, it's an Indian voice who claims he's in Atlanta or something of the sort. But that, and some of the examples you gave, maybe reading x-rays or providing legal services and so on. Those seem to be the most vulnerable to some of the technological changes we are seeing, especially artificial intelligence. So is it really a good idea to bet on that? And even if you think about the services sector, you know, again, this part of the services sector, the high-end services, is what gets the most attention as we think about trade. But if you think about India's services sector, much of it is really, you know, the mom-and-pop retail shop operations and so on. So if you look at the overall contribution to GDP or employment, it's not been that massive. So is this really a good bet for India to make?
So I think there are a couple of questions embedded in what you're saying. First, I mean, to some extent, when we're talking about these high-skilled services, we are certainly talking about an enclave in the Indian economy. It's a small set of people educated in the best institutions. There aren't so many of them at to world levels. Somebody from the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, I would set any day against any of the management graduates from here. I mean, they're pretty competent.
He's a graduate of one of those, so you should know.
Well, but that said, it's a small group. It's also, as you point out, certain areas are vulnerable. I mean, we already know software programming. With AI, you know, your productivity can be improved 50%. So you do need to take advantage of all these tools. Will you be totally displaced? No. Because I think the usual economic argument is as services become cheaper, demand will also increase, right? And so to my mind, it's not obvious that, first, we're certainly nowhere near AI displacing these people totally. But also, whatever we've seen of AI is so far it also can work very well as an aid. You were talking about customer service reps sitting in India. Well, one of the sort of early studies on AI that I've seen basically says how AI helps is really in bringing these guys up to speed, that it can give them prompts to the normal questions that are asked, and then they can know where to look and answer the question. But it does need a person to try and filter that out. Now, over time, less and less need for that person. So obviously, you have to take advantage of the technological changes that are happening. Some of it will be job displacing, much of it could be job enhancing, and there'll be a whole new set of jobs that will emerge, which we have no idea about. I mean, I understand AI prompter is a job that has emerged. The guy who sort of gives the prompt to ChatGPT to get an answer, okay? So as with every technology that will happen, India can ride that wave. It doesn't need to be submerged by that wave. But more important, you know, what we're saying is don't pick a sector, but recognize that what you need to do to make India competitive is focus on the basics. You need to improve schooling, improve the quality of education. Lots to be done there, enormous amounts. And we're not shy about talking about India's deficiencies here, how Indian education needs vast improvement. India, even at higher education levels, I talked about a few schools which are really good, but India doesn't have one university in the top 100. We need to do a lot more to think about all those. But if you do that, the private sector will figure out which sector makes most sense. I'm not talking about industrial policy. I don't think, what I'm saying is recognize that it's not just manufacturing-led growth. Stop subsidizing the living daylights out of it and, you know, putting tariffs on your to expand manufacturing there. We don't know that it'll work. Instead, think of where you're successful. Think about why you were successful and do more things to make that even more successful. For example, in services, one, as has been repeated many times, data is or are the new oil, right? It's so central. Data protection is so important to be able to sell services legitimately in a trustworthy fashion, right? We already see the trouble that Huawei has gotten into because there's a fear that backdoors will be built into Huawei's equipment. TikTok is running into trouble because we simply don't believe that the Chinese government can't sort of get data on our kids. by requiring it of TikTok. That's where India could have an advantage if it does the right thing. If it sets up strong privacy protection, if it limits what the government can ask, has a judicial process through which that government can be restrained, that could expand the role of India in information services. Telemedicine may not happen if you can't convince the other side that your data that you're getting will be kept private. But if you can, how much more can governments could trust you? Even their national health insurance could pay for long-distance services if that alleviates the burden. The national health system in NHS in Britain is overwhelmed. If some part of it could be outsourced, it will make a huge difference. So we're not picking sectors. What we're saying is the basics, regardless of whether you do manufacturing or services, needs to be improved. Make sure that you're not favoring one versus the other. Do what you can to move on all dimensions. India desperately needs jobs in any area. Do that. But eventually that will result in growth.
Yeah. So that's a very nuanced message, but again, the book has this sense of the services sector playing to India's strengths, but a different interpretation of many of the facts that you put on the table is that India's weaknesses, long-held weaknesses related to the financial system, labor laws, infrastructure have held back manufacturing. So you don't talk very much about the Make in India 2025 I'm sorry, it's just the Make in India, it's Made in China 2025. It's the Make in India program which, tried to at least have the objective of reinvigorating Indian manufacturing, essentially by saying, let's try to remove some of these obstacles to manufacturing. Now, you're making a valid point that you just set the right environment and then let markets determine where they go. But given that India is starting off with these huge disadvantages at a very difficult time when the rest of the world seems to be, going towards implementing industrial policies of various sort. In the US, you have the IRA, the CHIPS Act. In China, you have the Made in China Act. Why should India cede this space entirely? And do you think that the sort of approach that other countries are taking to sort of encourage their own manufacturing sectors, that India should basically back off and try to play by the right rule book while everybody else plays by a different rule book?
Well, so this is the problem with industrial policy, right? You focus on the shiny things and you forget about the basics. Even while the government has been talking about Make in India, the most labor-intensive sectors of the Indian economy have actually shrunk in relative terms. India accounted for 4+% of global trade in garments. It's now in the low 3s. Who's taken the place? Even as China has ceded place, it's Bangladesh and Vietnam. And garments are the most labor-intensive of sectors that you can think of. But this is not just one sector. 11 out of the 23 sectors in the Indian Index of Industrial Policy are doing worse now than they did, 8-9 years ago. So what I'm saying is that the problem with industrial policy is you pick the shiny sectors. Why does India need chip manufacturing? So we are now subsidizing chip manufacturers to make in India, right? What are they going to make? They're going to make 28 nanometer chips. What's the rationale? Oh, we need this sector because it's so central to development. Well, Netherlands has a chip machine manufacturing firm, ASML, which doesn't make chips. The most successful companies in the chip industry, NVIDIA, Qualcomm, Broadcom, don't make chips. They design them, right? Apple doesn't make chips. It designs them. The point here is you have this manufacturing fetish, and you think somehow you will become secure when you have some manufacturing. 28 nanometer chips, which is what India's embarking on with close to $10 billion in subsidy, is not state of the art. State of the art is 2-3 nanometer chips. Oh, we have to start somewhere. Well, why not start 5-10 years from now at making 2-3 nanometer chips? No, we need this for security. Well, how are you going to be secure? You're making the chip, but you don't make the wafers. You don't make the chemicals that go into it. You don't make the machines that go into it. And many of these things are made by your friends. So you're not in any danger of isolation. Why not let them expand their chip industry and buy it when there's a chip glut? Because again and again, the chip industry goes into gluts. The clever thing is spend that $10 billion on improving your education system, your healthcare system, get a top university. Let that churn out the design engineers. By the way, India has 300,000 design engineers, chip design engineers. It doesn't make any chips. They work for the NVIDIAs, the Qualcomms, and the Broadcoms of the world. Expand on that. What we're saying is have a vision which is based on, what we teach our MBAs or our economic students. Focus on your strengths, expand them, and stop chasing chimeras because you think that, this is something that you must have. This must have a chip industry, to my mind, is probably the most, it makes sense perhaps for the United States because it's a big, powerful, rich economy. But if you're friends with the United States, why not buy the United States chips? Why not buy Taiwan's chips? Why not buy Infineon's chips, which are made in Europe? You're not going to be shut off from all of those. So I don't understand the logic behind India choosing the chip industry for security when it has so many more needs at this point. You've got to pick your battles. You can't finance every battle.
By the way, I'd like to make this a more interactive discussion, so we'll take lots of questions along the way. And I'm going to ask Raghu one more question, and then we'll turn to you for a couple of questions. Kool got us started by saying that India is doing very well. It's on track to become the third largest economy, but there are questions about how well India really is doing. What is your sense? How fast is India growing? Does it have a chance of catching up to the sort of third largest power in the world vision that many of our leaders seem to have?
I think India is doing well, 6.5% growth.
You take
but
that
not
number
well
at face
enough.
value?
No, the numbers are 8.5 right now. So I'm subtracting a couple of percentage points, partly because we don't need to go into the technical details, but the details, I don't think the numbers are being fudged. I just think they're overly optimistic for a variety of reasons, including the fact that they read off the large firms and not enough of the small and medium sector, which is not doing that well. There's an inflation adjustment, which sort of is really volatile, and now the inflation adjustment is really favoring India because the inflation adjustment. But I think India is growing at 6.5. That is hugely creditable. I don't want people to get the sense that there isn't a strong India story. There is. And to Kool's point, absolutely, India will, Japan and Germany are not growing. If India grows at 6.5, it will overtake them surely in the next few years. Because India is 3.8, 3.9 trillion in GDP dollars. And, that's 2 or 3 years of growth. It should overtake Germany. But that's not the issue. India has 1.4 billion people. And so the per capita income is much, it's the poorest country in the G20. And that leads to the question, what were the other successful countries in the G20 doing when they were at India's per capita income level? And there you start seeing a big difference between China and Korea and India, because they grew much faster when they were at India's per capita level. So we're growing fast, great, but not fast enough. And what's an example of that? It's the huge amount of unemployment and underemployment in India today. And we offer examples in the book. Let me just throw out an example, which is there were 6,000 jobs advertised for a low-level revenue officer in the state of Madhya Pradesh last year. There were 1.2 million applicants, 200 per job. And of that 1.2 million applicants, there were something like close to 100,000 MBAs and 100,000 engineers. Now, that says a couple of things. First, a lot of people with degrees looking for jobs, but it also says that many of these degrees aren't particularly good, that they're not attracting the private sector to create jobs for them. So India has some work to do to employ these people. So why is this important? Because India is a young country. It is experiencing what is called the population dividend. More people entering the labor force at this point, the working age population as a share of the total population increasing. That's when many countries got accelerated growth because the growth sort of pushed them much. India needs that acceleration. But if it can't employ those people, it's not going to get that acceleration. Where is India growing? It's growing in the capital-intensive sectors, in big industry, big firms, which are much more capital-intensive. While small and medium industries, small and medium sectors where small and medium industries thrive, are not doing well. And so this is a very, very mixed sort of growth path. And one of the consequences is growing inequality. Frustration in the lower middle class and the middle class because they're not participating even in the 6.5% growth. So growth is visible for anybody who goes to India. You'll see, gleaming new airports, gleaming new highways, great, fast trains now. All that is real, but it's not reaching every Indian. And if it doesn't reach every Indian, it eventually backs up because domestic demand slows down. People who are poorer have stronger demand. If they don't have jobs, they're not able to spend, it backs up. You're seeing consumption growth slow down quite a bit in India even with these strong GDP numbers. And of course, it creates social tension. People increasingly want their community to have reserved jobs and reserved places in universities because they find, there's very little outside the government which is attractive, which is an aberration for a country that is growing so, at this very decent pace of 6.5%.
Okay, so we should turn to what India needs to do to stay on this path and perhaps improve its success rate. But let me open up the floor to a couple of questions at this stage. I'll take the one from this gentleman. You'll get a mic. Please identify yourself, and one request. Raghu's talking about his book. If you have speeches, harangues, and so on, please reserve them for later. Please keep your questions very sharp and precise and related to the theme of the book. And please identify yourself.
Hi, my name is Suresh Shinoy. I'm a founder and a vice chairman of our organization called Wheels Global Foundation, where we seek technology solutions for solving problems around water, health, education, environment, and sustainability. It's an initiative of the alumni of the Indian Institutes of Technology. My question is, I applaud your views on putting emphasis on the service sector. However, there are 800 million people who live in rural India with aspirations which are comparable to anyone in the urban sector. And their needs are very basic: access to water, access to healthcare, and so forth. And India's challenge also is to create 12 million jobs a year, which primarily comes from that sector. So why do you not look at the 800 million people in rural India, which is more than the population of Europe and North America combined, as a major consumer sector for investments from Western economies, even from China, to sort of serve that sector of the population? Okay. Going back to bottom of the pyramid, if you will. Thank you.
Thanks. Let's take one more from there.
Yes, my name is Roger Cochetti. I'm an editorial contributor on technology policy to the Hill newspaper. And my question has to do, and I claim no expertise on the subject of your book, but just following the logic of it, chips are a foundational manufacturing segment. In other words, you need a supply of chips to build everything upward from Tata cars to cell phones or anything else. And if there's anything that Indian government probably has learned from the response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it is that trade sanctions and trade embargoes are now a standard item in tradecraft. India has several disputed borders, and imagine at some point in the future, India invaded Kashmir or did something. I think government leaders in India and elsewhere have got to accept the fact that if you don't make it domestically, you are subject to a politically based trade embargo that will cut you off from supplies. So you have to figure out what supplies you actually need domestically. So it seems to me, without, again, any expertise, that the logic of the Indian government is that in order to survive trade sanctions that we might be hit with, we have to do this, this, and this. So could you respond to the logic of that?
There are a couple of things that I think there is a national security angle which many countries, including the US, seem to bring to bear on discussions of industrial policy and then the rural masses.
Yeah, so let me start backwards. I think that's a very important question to come to. I mean, the national security angle could be played multiple ways. You could argue that Russia has succeeded in maintaining its war machine despite embargoes, despite sanctions, just by smuggling. Chips are small. Pick a country, Belarus, smuggle it through Belarus. It also has a friend at the border, China, which it's getting some stuff from. And so I think another way of reading this is they're not very effective, these sanctions, especially when they're on small items. Boeing parts are still being obtained by Russia in many ways. And so the notion that you absolutely need this, I'm also a little reluctant to go to the place where I say India is going to start breaking friendships across the world and require sort of to stand up to sanctions. That's an India which I don't think will be helpful for India's development path. And I would say, follow Deng Xiaoping's advice, basically focus, what was it, walk, tread softly or whatever. Don't make noise at this point. First, strengthen your economy, become strong economically, and then hopefully spread good values around the world. Don't spread the values of domination and bullying. That's not what we need to become a superpower for, is to spread the values of peace and harmony. It may be naive, but it's something that is embedded in the thoughts of the father of the country, Mahatma Gandhi, and I think that's worth spreading around the world. So I would say, don't worry about a situation where the whole world turns hostile. Don't do anything, and that requires some doing. You don't need to go there. There's a lot of development that you can do without that. And you can make friends with a lot of countries that are perfectly happy to supply you what you need. So we don't need a chip industry separately. Plus, I think anything is going to be temporary. If you want to avoid temporary emergencies, stockpile some chips. Buy the stuff, create a national sort of security pile. But you don't have to have a chip industry, which, we're talking about a shipbuilding industry. Chip and shipbuilding are two of the most cyclical industries. And every time they are on the down cycle, they go to the government with a begging bowl and say, please help me, because there's so many workers who will be out of a job. There's so much technology which will evaporate. We don't need to go there. That's there on the. You make a very important point, and the wrong message to take from our book is we're about that enclave of highly skilled people and jobs for them. What we're saying is, yes, we can expand on that, we can build on that. That can be the leading sector of the Indian economy. That can be the sector that draws forward the Indian economy. But we have to worry about those 800 million people, which means a whole lot of services will be targeted at them. Healthcare and education are two central issues, which not only can make more Indians employable, but can themselves be a huge source of employment. And this can be in very basic things. So for example, every creche, they call Anganwadis in India, creches aimed at poor people, has a worker who is, has a lot of stuff to do. So some studies have said, if you employ another worker part-time in the Anganwadi, they can teach the kids, even while the other worker is helping with health and nutrition. Combined, you can have a much bigger effect on early childhood than one alone. 1.5 million Anganwadis get mothers in the village who've completed a high school education to join in. That's a job for them. Makes them over time employable as they get to run the ropes in the Anganwadi, but also helps the kids. That's a very useful solution which has proven returns, but can also create jobs. But, there's this talk of, India needs to become much more renewable. And of course, the services path will be much less energy intensive, emission intensive than a manufacturing path. I'm not, again, saying we should abandon manufacturing, but if we were to try and become another China and flood the world with cheap goods, it would create a problem for the world also. Instead, think about what are called solar didis or solar bands. Start small sort of outfits in the villages, basically selling renewable energy. Once upon a time, it was cell phones and selling minutes. But here you can have a viable business distributing solar energy with a loan from the government to build that out. That would help on the emissions front. It would help create jobs. So again and again, we need to be thinking about jobs from two different perspectives. One, what jobs can people do with the skills they actually have? And that is being realistic about the skills they have. And the other is, if we were to upgrade those skills, what jobs could they do? We need to work on both fronts. We cite this survey which says 50% of Indian graduates are unemployable. Now, that doesn't mean they're forever unemployable. It means many of them need some remedial education. They're hungry. Give them that remedial education that allows them to become employable. Some of that has to come from firms, apprenticeships, et cetera, that some of the parties today are talking about in the elections. Some of it has to come from government programs. But we need to see what works, because that problem of unemployability is huge. So absolutely, we need to think about the rest. And when I talk about service jobs, it's not about programmers only. It's about that security guard. Security guard is probably the most fastest growing job in India today, because in the cities, they require many more of them. But what about more barefoot doctors? That first doctor you go to in the village is not a doctor, has no certificate. They might have worked as a pharmacist or may have been a nurse's aide inside a clinic. They use that knowledge to give you a diagnosis. Well, could we train them up to recognize the basic disease and the basic sort of answers to those diseases? Give them a certificate. And then work with them. There are lots of sort of halfway solutions we talk in the book, which actually could be very important for India's needs today. If you want healthcare to reach everybody, it's impossible for everyone to see a doctor. But a lot of them could see these nurse practitioners, and then they could feed into the system based on the severity of the disease. So I think there's a lot that can be done, but it can also create many more jobs for India today. And that really is the key.
That's a good segue to go into thinking about what needs to be done to keep India on this path to doing well. And in your book, you're quite fair in your assessment, I think. You do give credit where credit is due. And the Modi administration, while it may have its flaws, quite a few flaws, has accomplished quite a bit in terms of different areas of economic reform in particular. Some of these were started by the Manmohan Singh administration before the Modi administration, but I think the Modi administration has carried these things on very effectively. So, if you think about the digitization of the economy, some of the easing of restrictions on labor laws, some spending on infrastructure, the government seems to be trying to bring down the fiscal deficit after an expansion during the COVID period. The Reserve Bank of India seems to be doing quite well in managing inflation. So a lot has been done. Now, in each of these areas, my own sense is that a lot more remains to be done before this growth trajectory could be locked in. And in your book, you go through a variety of reforms, variety of big ideas and small ideas. What would you think of as the 2 or 3 biggest priorities for India in terms of the reforms it needs in order to lock in its growth path?
Well, let me start first by, I think the Modi administration has done a fair amount. It would be wrong to say it has done nothing. 6.5% requires some doing. I think its greatest success has been implementation. Doing things that have been started elsewhere and carrying them out. Many of the programs that the Modi administration has, especially on the welfare side, were, dreamt up by previous governments. But are being implemented more effectively at this point. I think perhaps the biggest success is on the infrastructure build-out. I talked about the highways, the ports, the airports, and that certainly is a huge success of this government. In fact, that's the place where you see employment going up much more. So two areas, two sectors in India where employment has grown over the last few years as a share of the economy. One is construction, and there the Modi government deserves praise. The second is agriculture, and there it requires criticism of the government. No developing country sees agricultural employment going up, and that's basically saying you're not creating enough jobs in services and manufacturing. So praise and criticism. The problem to some extent, and then I'll get to what I suggest, but the problem to some extent is when you have a government which becomes more authoritarian over time, when you have a press which doesn't feel compelled to ask critical questions, there is no feedback which reaches the government in an effective way. Industrialists are really scared. They don't give the government a frank view of what is going wrong. And as a result, you hear two different conversations. One is what they're willing to say in public, and one is what you hear in private. And that, I think, is problematic for a government, because especially if it's going on a difficult path, which is untested, you need feedback, you need course correction. And if you can't get it, you can go off track hugely. And I think that's where India's democracy should be seen as a strength today, rather than as weakness. India's institutions need shoring up, not weakening. And to my mind, if I were to pick, the biggest frailty in this government is that it simply is not, in some ways, supportive of these institutions. And as a result, it simply doesn't know when it's going off track. That said, if you are going towards a creative economy, perhaps the biggest thing we can do is inspire more debate, inspire more discussion. The same rebel who hates the administration is also possibly somebody who's going to invent some new thing, which is quite different from what the establishment, we have these images of Steve Jobs when he was a young, sort of hip, long-haired person working in the garage. But that's often your image of the iconoclast. They sort of dislike all manner of establishments. You can't have one and not the other. If you want the ferment of innovation, of debate, you need democracy. So, surprising as it may seem, I think preserving and strengthening India's democracy is job one if India wants to grow successfully. The old authoritarian catch-up growth through manufacturing path, I think, is much, much harder and will close off much, much sooner given protectionist tendencies in the world. And as a result, for India to follow that, to my mind, doesn't make a lot of economic sense.
So that's interesting. You're putting that at the top of your list of priorities.
Absolutely, because what it does is it allows for consensus building and change. When you talked about labor laws, when you talk about agriculture, which needs enormous support, that's where 800 million people sort of, subsist around it. You need to build a consensus. This administration, promulgated some agricultural reforms, which immediately met with opposition. Whether it was vested interests or not, the point is farmers were willing to sit out in the fields for a long time opposing the government, and then it backed down. There are so many other areas where we need consensus on reform. You can't just bulldoze your way through, especially because, even if you suppress democracy some, there will be vestiges of democracy still left. And as a result, I think it's better to be more democratic than less democratic. And I think what India desperately needs at this point is a strong opposition, whoever that opposition may be. It needs a strong opposition just to act as a check and balance on the government. India has too centralized a government, too powerful a government, partly created post-independence in order to deal with the horrors of partition, when there was a fear that India would not stick together as a country. So we, had a lot of faith. Unlike, the Federalist Papers, we sort of put a lot of faith in the government and a lot of faith in government powers. Today, those fears are much less front and center. The fear is of, having government run by people who are not as conscious of the interests of the people. And so I think decentralization, the book talks a lot about how we should decentralize far more. State of Uttar Pradesh, 240 million people run from the state capital. We need the 3,000 plus counties that the United States have and more to deal with how big a population we have. Local government can pay much more interest to the concerns of the local people. If you want stronger education, local government has to have much more powers. If the teacher doesn't show up in school, you can't complain, 500 miles away in Lucknow. You have to complain locally to your local village and say the teacher didn't show up. And the local village has to have the power to rectify that. So lots of stuff for India to do, but I think job one is democracy. Decentralization is probably part of that, to democratize the democracy in a sense, make it less centralized, give more power to the states, and within the states, push the states to give more power to the localities. Everybody wants to decentralize, but only up to their level. We have to fight that tendency that people hold on to power when they can. But that would be on the government side. On what they do, I think much more of an emphasis on education and healthcare. And of course, these are divided subjects between the states and the center, but if we spend more resources, it will pay off hugely in the years to come. So again, I'm not advocating pick services. I'm saying give services a chance. Don't put all your eggs in the manufacturing basket. It's not necessary. But focus on improving the capabilities of your biggest resource, 1.4 billion people. And that means healthcare, education, childcare, and even capability, entrepreneurial opportunities. Remove the red tape when you can and let them flourish.
So you went to chapters 12 and 13 of your book where you talk a lot about democracy and the institutional framework, which I agree are probably the most important. But let me drag you back to the earlier chapters. You talked a little bit about education, getting the government out of the way in some respects. Now, back in 2007, Raghu was actually put in charge of a committee that was to envision what India's financial sector should look like. And in fact, he had involved me in that project on the periphery to try to think a little bit about the macro structure. I was surprised that there wasn't that much about the financial sector in your book. I know that the banks are doing a little better than they were a few years ago, but do you think on the financial sector in particular, we are at a place where the financial system is doing a good job of intermediating domestic and foreign resources?
Well, it's a steady improvement, right? When I was governor of the Reserve Bank, one of the biggest issues was the bad loans that had built up in the system. And so we started the process of cleaning up the bad loans. We basically stopped the evergreening and forced the banks to recognize, which was job one. Job two was for them to acquire capital and write off some of these loans which were uncollectible. Today, the banking system is in much better shape. Of course, the key issue for regulators and supervisors is to make sure it doesn't find a new way of getting into trouble. It's a dynamic process. But I think India's path of steady improvement is a good one. We started UPI in 2016 when I was there. Success is a million fathers.
The payment system.
This UPI is the payment system, bank-to-bank payments. Last I checked, 13 billion payments in the month of February. I feel proud to be associated with that. Not that we did that much on it. I think the only thing we did, to be frank, that was meaningful is to ensure that the non-banks were let into the system. because the non-banks had an incentive to emphasize the payments. And so we allowed we allowed the non-banks in. The banks were fighting very hard to say this should only be a bank thing, because after all, you're demanding a transfer from a bank account to a bank account, we should control it. And, call it my Chicago instincts, it was that once we let these guys in, have sole charge, there'll be very little competition. When I last checked, 95% of UPI transactions were done by the non-banks. So much so that now the banks are again clamoring to restrict the share of the non-banks. But the point is, competition plus innovation in India has had huge sort of payoffs. And you can see it. There's a lot to be proud of in India. But, for example, innovation on education. How do you give people a high quality education when it takes forever to create a good school, Sidwell or a Andover? It takes forever to create those schools. So here's an entrepreneur who basically says, look, I'm not going to create an Andover. That's too much trouble. But can I create something which is very good, which will give a lot of kids a really good education, and I need to scale it because everything in India is about 20 times, 100 times what it is in every other country. So what he basically did was essentially got lessons, 30,000 lessons, scripted. Beginning of class, you're going to show this video. Then you ask this question. Then you have a class discussion for 15 minutes. Stop it at 15 minutes. Here are the conclusions that you should reach. Everything scripted, 30,000 lessons. Before a teacher goes into class, a couple of days before, they get the script for the next class they're going to teach. I would hate to teach in such a school because I feel I want freedom to teach the kids. But this is a great method of teaching, of bringing, modest teachers to becoming good teachers, because you're ensuring the kids learn. And there's constant feedback. What did the kids learn? What do they think of the class? What the teacher keeps evaluating the students, etc. It's fantastic. They are reaching some 65,000 students. That is maybe 65 Sidwells, 65 Andovers, and 300,000 other students are using these lesson plans. And this is the early stage of expansion. These are the kinds of solutions India needs if it wants to move up the education level, new solutions. Similarly, I talked about those barefoot doctors. India needs those barefoot doctors, but needs them to be better trained, so that they can be the first port of call for those 800 million people sitting in the villages who don't have access to anything. But these guys, they go to because they trust them. Well, let's make sure they're, competent and give them a little bit more of training. Of course, the medical establishment hates anybody else who's certified without, spending the 5 years in doing a course and getting a residency.
So when you have two Indian guys talking, they can talk non-stop, although usually they get into an argument by this time, which we refrain from so far. But let's take a couple more audience questions, and then we will come back. Maybe those three. Can you keep them short, please? And we'll take those three questions. Actually, we'll take two questions from there and this lady here. Let's start with you, sir.
Thank you. Michael Muth, recent retired foreign service, and I'll start teaching at the Thunderbird Business School next month and then moving on to the University of Texas. But in the past, I taught at GITAM, the Gandhi Institute of Technology and Management in Visakhapatnam. I taught for a year, and there were many very intelligent students there, but one thing that I noticed was very few of the students had any industry experience before they came for their MBA program. And here in the US, one of our stalwart benefits is many MBA students have at least 2 or 3 years experience before they go back for their MBA. And so when the IIM Ahmedabads complain about not being ranked, I suspect that might have something to do with it. So I'm just curious, and I don't know about law schools, engineering schools, and so on, but I'm just wondering, is that still an issue, and what can be done about just the lack of practicality from not having those prior business experiences in MBA classes and potentially in other professions as well.
Thanks. Let's take a question here, and then we'll go back there.
I'm Omanjana. I work for an organization called the Union of Concerned Scientists, researching at the intersection of agriculture and climate change. You talk about the service sector being energy intensive and the need to move into renewable energy. But given kind of India's position within the global economy, what is the appetite in India right now, also the framework of the current government, to kind of bootstrap investments into the renewable energy sector, something to the tune of like the IRA did here in the US, right?
Okay.
I'm Vincent Belinga, a senior economist at the World Bank, and I'm actually moving to India in July, so I will be covering India. My question is related to your introductory remarks when you say that one of the motivation of this book was to have this book out there before the election so that it can influence probably the electoral process and eventually a policy maker. So my question is, how much hope do you have based on your knowledge of India and the current administration that this book will actually influence the ongoing electoral process, but also the policymaker in integrating the vision of this book?
Okay, let's take one last question, and then maybe we will move on.
Hi, my name is Samir Lal. I also work at the World Bank, and I had a very similar question, which is, I really like the formulation that you have of, following India's strengths. But what is, from a political economy point of view, what is the likely receptivity to that? Because there is always the attraction to the shiny objects, as you said. And so how do you make this happen? In other words, how optimistic are you that your recommendations would be accepted by the political class?
So Raghu, a couple of specific questions, and then is there hope?
Right. So let me start with hope. I think there's always hope. And, so long as we have democracy, there is hope. And I think that there's reason to believe that, the debate will continue. So we've had the usual pushback from ministers. Oh, these guys are full of it. They're talking only about manufacturing. They're talking only about services. First caricature the argument, and then make it so, make it a straw man, kill the straw man, and then you say, manufacturing is necessary. But I think they've increasingly been forced to defend their arguments. So I was interested in seeing that the press is now asking, what about value added in your manufacturing? You're claiming you're making so many cell phones. How much value added? That value added is something we've been pounding on the table for the last year and a half, writing about this stuff and saying you can't discuss just the assembly. You have to talk about how much value you're adding. So interestingly, the debate is expanding. And these questions are being asked. That's the first step. After that, people will examine, understand, and then move on. My experience with reports is they sit on a shelf. But it's not that they're dead. It's that they're germinating at the back of somebody's mind. Eswar mentioned the report that we wrote in 2007, 2008. Well, I became governor, and then I could implement that report. And a lot of what we did was actually driving elements of that report. So I think eventually there comes the right person, right government, which takes it forward. And I think as we see some of the constraints on the manufacturing-led exports path, we will rethink some of the other stuff. It'll happen. There was the question on energy, what was the question again? Sorry, just remind me.
Whether India could, rally the sort of resources the U.S. did in the form of the IRA.
India can't. And that's to some extent why I think, one of the problems with the subsidy-driven approach, it may be, as my son keeps pointing out, to be the only politically viable approach in the United States. But the United States is also, the richest country in the world and can support movement towards green with subsidies. The rest of the world, it's already stretched financially. India's debt to GDP is 85%. There's not a whole lot of fiscal room, especially when you've got pressing needs on education and healthcare. So it may well be the way you move forward is with more limited subsidies, perhaps some regulation. But I think the sense in India is very clearly that we're going to be at the forefront of experiencing climate change. And therefore, it is in India's interest to stop being a blocking sort of movement on climate change, to participate to the extent possible. We write in the book, maybe even lead parts of climate action, because South Asia is going to be so hugely affected. We're already seeing many aspects of it. So India has a good point, which is we didn't contribute to the mess. And in fact, right now we are emitting much less than the per capita average global income. And I have a proposal on how that can be used to set budgets and pay-fors from countries that are over-emitting to countries that are under-emitting. But I really think that regardless, we should start helping the world move forward rather than being a roadblock and saying, we didn't do it, so we don't have a responsibility for the solutions. Well, we better actually do something about it because the problem is coming to us. On the question of experience, that's a great point on the importance of experience for Indian students. That said, the US goes back and forth. So right now, the University of Chicago is starting a master's program in management for undergrads who want to go directly, because we find it really hard to bring them back after that 2 or 3 years experience. Increasingly, they're saying, hang it, I'm making a ton of money in my job with this finance firm. Why do I need to go back to get an MBA? But that said, I think that one Indian school which now has an experiential sort of emphasis is the Indian School of Business, which basically requires you to work and then brings you back for a 1-year MBA. So lots of possibilities. My sense is we'll figure out via media. But I do think one of the ways to make Indian graduates have better skills is much more of a practical training experience. Some of the political parties have now proposed a 1-year apprenticeship with industry, which will give them job skills. And so that may be part of the answer as we go forward.
So let's go back, Raghu, to talking about an issue that you already alluded to, which is India's institutional framework. You spoke quite eloquently about the need to maintain democratic institutions, a free press, and so on. So if you think about the broader institutional framework, it seems to be relatively important for economic growth and stability. It's important, as you said, for providing feedback to the governing class. If you want to think about one's country's currency playing an important role in international finance, a pet subject of mine, it plays an important role. So if you think about the elements of the institutional framework, there is the rule of law, there is the freedom of expression and the press, there are the more basic democratic institutions. Which of these do you see as under the most duress right now? And what do you think are the key priorities to make sure that we can shore up India's institutional framework?
Well, all of them, right? Take the press. Why does the press, mainstream press, succumb so easily? There's a pet phrase in India called Godi media, coined by somebody who was actually ejected from not ejected, but he left when his firm was taken over by one of the big industrialists close to the government. And what does Godi media mean? It means pet laptop media. And he says this because he basically says they don't have an independent view. They're allowed a little bit of leeway, but if they move off the reservation, wham, you get whacked. How do you get whacked? Well, simply by the government not giving you advertisements anymore. If you look at any Indian newspaper, there are 10 full-page advertisements by various governments in it. And that's a huge amount of money. Similarly, the government will say ministers can't talk to you anymore. That lack of access, the fact that they won't show up for your conferences, takes an enormous amount of money making out of these empires. And if you still persist in being a pain in the neck, a friendly industrialist will take you over. There is no effective antitrust in these matters in India today. So in that respect, the mainstream press is not an effective source of criticism. Yes, they will publish, and there are some notable exceptions. They continue publishing, but even the notable exceptions you won't get, MSNBC or a Fox, which are basically opposed in visceral ways to the establishment. That will not happen in India. What you will get is even the independent media is much more balanced, a CNN, if you will, than on the extremes. And that's because they simply cannot afford to go out on a limb. Where you're seeing a huge change is in online media. And many of these people who have lost their jobs in mainstream media have gone on to online and are now have flourishing channels there. And of course, the government strongly wants to limit that also, so far without success. So press is important.
Let me just ask you something about that, though. I mean, if you look at what's happening in the US, it seems like a complete mess, and some have argued, and I'm not making this argument, but I want to put it up for you, that China seems to have done perfectly well with relatively weak institutions. Maybe India cannot afford to have all these grand notions of strong institutions at this stage. Maybe one day India can mature to that. What would you say to that argument?
I think that may have been a more relevant argument 20, 30 years ago, when India was trying to follow an economic path, and maybe democracy was not as effective then. Again, it's arguable. I don't want to say that it's... everybody would love to have a Lee Kuan Yew as their authoritarian leader. Nobody imagines that it could be Mobutu Sese Seko. And there's a huge difference between the two, and you may be stuck with the wrong one. So the virtue of democracy is it allows you to throw the idiots out. And that, I think, is a virtue which deserves to be preserved. But that said, I think now it seems to me democracy is a strength for India rather than a weakness, because democracy allows more deliberation, more consensus building, et cetera, feedback, all those things that matter. And India is too large a country to be managed without all that. I mean, we have a virtual riot going on in Manipur for the last so many months. And, this is problematic. And, Naipaul coined the million mutinies phrase. Million mutinies can be a good thing if they're small and are about, changing in a constitutional way. A million mutinies which are on the streets is not where India wants to go. And democracy sort of allows consensus building, allows people with very different opinions to get a sense of what is reasonable. So I think going forward, democracy is India's strength, not its weakness, especially when you go to creative industries. One of the big complaints, must have noted this in China, is that with the shift in China towards more authoritarianism, many academics feared that China's innovative bent, which a lot of it came from the private sector, especially in the non-defense aspects. That has been quelled to some extent, because now you also have to second guess what a bureaucrat in Beijing wants. And that bureaucrat is trying to second guess what the supreme leader wants. And that's a sequence which doesn't lead anywhere good.
So we might have time for one or two last quick questions. Let me take this and that. I'm sorry, we're not. Could you please keep it very short and precise?
Sorry, I've been droning on and limiting their time, but apologies.
Not at all. Thank you so much. My name is Smriti Patel. First of all, I just want to say brilliantly facilitated and moderated. Thank you so much. And I love the clarity of your responses. So I haven't read your book, but I will. My question is this. Given that we see India very much becoming, or is, the darling of the West in many ways. What are the levers that need to be pulled in order to have it, I'm trying to articulate the question, in order to have it think more carefully about human rights, recognizing fully that there are a lot of paradoxical perspectives that the West also holds and has those behaviors too?
Let's take that question from the gentleman there. By the way, the book, in case you haven't read it, will be available on sale outside right after this event. It's a very fine book, I can tell you, and Professor Rajan will be around for a few minutes after the talk to sign it, in case you're interested, but please.
My name is Kiran Muthusamy. My question is regarding the chip design that you talked about. China currently has a very robust manufacturing sector, but they're also trying to mimic USA in terms of like the chip design investment. So there's a huge investment going on. So my first part of the question is like, isn't India also trying, your suggestion was also similar, that we tried to mimic USA in terms of the chip design sector, which China is also trying to emulate. And the second part is regarding the political climate, in the sense that the Modi government is also trying to emulate the autocratic ways of, let's say, China and Lee Kuan Yew. So, because that's probably the only way they think that infrastructure is possible. So in these situations, what should, let's say, a state like Tamil Nadu should do when the states and the center are fighting each other?
Okay. All right. So, Raghu, we have just a few minutes left. So maybe you can talk a little bit about chips governance, but then maybe you can leave us with some hope related to the last question. What do you see as India's place in the world? We've talked about it becoming the third largest economy. It seems to be the most dynamic of the large economies right now. What do you see as India's place in the world?
Yeah, thanks. I wasn't quite clear what the question on chip design was. What is the question?
Okay, so basically you said that we have to carve a niche. India has to carve a niche that needs to be different from China. But actually China is also trying to mimic the developed nations. So.
Sure. All I'm saying there is we are better positioned to compete because we already have a whole bunch of designers there. And our lack of, we have some areas of manufacturing we're very good at, two-wheelers, for example, but we have no experience in chips. So we don't need to be held back just because we don't manufacture chips. We can design chips. And we're, with English language, we have top, reasonably good universities. I think we can do a decent job there. That's all I'm saying. On the political economy, let me put aside Tamil Nadu. I think the point is decentralization, and we need to respect the fiscal federalism that the government has talked about, but in practice, lots of problems in implementation. We need that. You have to respect opposition states, give them adequate funding, and not hold back permissions and so on. I think that's a great question. What does the outside world sort of have to do? Recognizing the outside world is not setting a great example itself. And I think the reality is the battle for Indian democracy will be fought in India. It's not going to be fought outside. And that, every opposition leader is very clear about that. We don't need the US to fight our battles for us. But I would add one thing. Don't put your hand on the scale. And that's what the West is in danger of doing. When it basically goes gushing to Delhi, all praise for India is great. But when you praise a specific government and its specific policies while ignoring the downsides, I think you're putting the finger on the scale. And that, to my mind, has to be kept in your mind. I don't think India should associate with a particular administration. It should treat all US administrations independently, recognizing the friendship between the two countries. It's much more important than a specific administration. And I think similarly, as far as possible, US policy should be about a friendship between India and the United States, but not get drawn in. It's all too easy when you have a dominant political establishment to think this is the only establishment and will forever be this establishment. And then you don't distinguish between the country and the administration in power. It's important to recognize there's a difference. Finally, I mean, I think even though this ongoing election has been written off as a cakewalk, I think it's going to be interesting. Let us see what happens. Certainly the opposition parties are trying really hard to come together, and they're trying really hard to tell people this is not a foregone conclusion. And it is your duty. I mean, the issue of democracy is being raised again and again by the opposition. I think that's healthy. And as I said, my hope is whatever the outcome of this election, we have a healthy opposition in India at the end of it, which will make, I think, Indian policy much better. I think you have some market investors thinking it will not. I think they're completely wrong. That, Indian coalitions have often produced fairly reasonable policies. But more important, I think, a change in government outlook periodically is useful for the health of the economy.
So any of you who has read Raghu's prior books knows that they are written with enormous intellectual rigor, sharpness of mind, clarity, and they offer a sense of realism, but also a sense of optimism and hope. And this book is no different. It does talk about one of the presumably soon-to-be great powers of the world. It's on the way, and I think the path that Raghu has laid out and the realism with which he approaches the sense of what needs to be done is very clearly conveyed in the book. So like I said, the book will be available, and for those of you who are watching online, go get it at your favorite bookstore.
Actually, before we end, I have to emphasize this is a joint product with Rohit Lamba, who has been a great co-author. He's now going to be in your neck of the woods at Cornell.
Indeed. So thank you all very much for coming, and thank you, Raghu, for a very lively and fascinating discussion. You've enriched our minds. Thank you.